All right, folks, thank you for joining. I am going to get started now. So let's see. There we go. This is our Reach Code Newcomers webinar series, and the idea for this came from some local government staff who are just starting to work on Reach Codes, and we're wishing for some more information about them. So we're trying to respond to that need, and would appreciate your feedback at any point to help us know what else you need to know, or what's on target, what's missing the point. So these are the topics we're going to talk about today. During the welcome, we'll hear from Danuta Drostovich from the California Energy Commission. And then I'm going to talk about the what and why of Reach Codes, as well as an overview of the process. I'm Karen Christensen. I work at ABAG MTC, and I lead BayREN's Codes and Standards program. My background's in city planning. I worked for local governments, and I was introduced to Reach Codes when a Reach Code landed on my desk with the directive to figure out how to adopt it. And I didn't know anything about them. So I've been there, I've been the newcomer, and I have a lot of sympathy for that because there's a lot of information there. After that, Misty Bruceri is going to introduce building codes and summarize legal requirements. Misty is a consultant who coordinates the statewide IOU investor-owned utility Reach Code team. She's been working on and with Reach Codes for decades, and she's a true expert in the field. So we're going to draw on that. And then we'll hopefully have some time for questions and answers and a quick conclusion. And Angie Hacker, the California Climate Energy Collaborative Statewide Best Practices Coordinator, is going to be facilitating the discussion there. So we've got a great team. Looking forward to getting into this. So before we get going too much, I wanted to just talk about the logistics. We will be recording today. We are recording today, so hopefully that's okay with everyone. If it's not, hop out. The recordings of the presentations will be available online afterwards. That's the intent. We won't be putting on, if there's a lot of discussion at the end, which hopefully we'll have time for, we won't put that online, but the presentations we will have. And for questions during the presentations, if you have an urgent clarification that you need, like if I throw in some jargon and forget to explain what it is, and you're like, what is she talking about? Please raise your hand, and we'll get to that. At various natural breaks throughout, we'll pause for some quick questions at that point. And then if you have comments or more involved questions, please put those in the chat as we go. And when we get to the Q&A and discussion at the end, we'll have a chance to go over all of those. So before we really dig in, I just wanted to touch on the purpose of this. I want to be clear for everyone what we're going to cover, what we're not going to cover. I know a variety of people signed up, and so the intent here is to provide some information to the local government staff who are new to Reach Codes, so that they'll have the information that they need in order to be able to work on them, to consider them, and move forward in whatever way is appropriate for them. We're not going to go over like how to comply with the Reach Code. We're not going to go over like particular, say you should adopt this Reach Code or that Reach Code, or how to advocate to get a particular Reach Code adopted. We're not going to dig into the real technical side a little bit in webinar 3, but it's going to say that this is intended for newcomers. So we're not going to get into the engineering questions behind some of this. So if that's what you're looking for, now's your time to bow out. Our feelings won't be hurt. It's okay. But just want to make sure everyone knows this is what we're doing. So I'm going to put a link in the chat to a quick poll, and I'd like everyone to do that. And I think I'm going to have to exit my presenter view. The poll has 2 questions, just, basically, what do you do? And what part of the state are you in? And if people can just reply to that, let me know if you have any trouble with it. But then we can get a sense of who's in the room, and we'll know who we're talking with. So I see a quick question in the chat. I'll answer while we are doing the poll. Will the session cover fee studies? We will talk about cost effectiveness studies at a very, very high level later on, but there will be session 3 of this webinar series, which is in March. Will focus specifically on cost effectiveness analyses. So if that's what you're looking for, that would probably be the best session to come to. I see a couple folks are introducing themselves in the chat. That's great too. Thank you for that. So we do see this is great. We've got mostly local government. We also have a fair bit of other, and then some consultants, utilities, regional or state, and architects. In terms of geography, that's great. We've got a pretty wide variety. Strong Bay Area showing, lots from Southern California, also Central Coast, other Sierras, and other Northern California. So good, we've got folks from all over the state. We've got mostly local governments, but a variety of others as well. So just wanted a chance for us to do that. Okay, so with that, let me go back into the slideshow here. And I'm going to pass the microphone off to Danuta Drostovich to start us off today. She's from the California Energy Commission. Thanks, Danuta.
Good morning, everybody. I am very pleased to welcome you to this REACH Code Newcomers webinar series. My name is Danuta, and I work in the Building Standards Office of the California Energy Commission's Efficiency Division. If, thanks in part to this series, you decide to develop and adopt what is known as an Energy REACH Code and submit it to the Energy Commission for approval, it will probably be channeled through me. And to be clear, I want to confirm a quick definition. A local ordinance that exceeds the current version of the State Energy Code is what is known as a REACH Code. And in some parts of the country, it's also called a stretch code. Stepping back a bit from REACH codes, it's important to know that the state of California's Constitution gives local jurisdictions powers and authority to enact all sorts of local ordinances, an authority that isn't available in many other states. Here in California, cities, towns, and counties can enact provisions to protect the health and safety of their residents with regard to fire, earthquake, air quality, sea level rise, and other potential threats. All that's required is that the ordinances be filed with the California Building Standards Office. The one exception to this process is energy. State code requires that local jurisdictions that exceed the current energy code first submit their ordinances to the California Energy Commission before filing with the Building Standards Office. The statute underlying the local ordinance program is found in Public Resources Code 25402, .1 H2, and the important section reads as follows. The city or county must file the basis of its determination that the standards are cost effective with the Commission, and the Commission must find that the standards will require a diminution of energy consumption, so lower energy use than the state code. I and the Energy Commission are always available to answer your questions, but there are many other resources available to you, and this webinar series has been developed to show you the tools and resources that can help you through the REACH Code process. I'm now happy to hand it back to Karen Christensen to begin this process. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Danuta. And we will go over that again a little bit later on as well. So as Danuta said, a REACH code it's an ordinance. It's adopted by a local government. It requires something in addition to the requirements of the state building code. So something it reaches above, reaches beyond stretches above. Sometimes they're called stretch codes, beyond codes. We tend to use reach codes in California. The basic building code. So, you know, and the important point here is it works from and it builds on the California code, what's adopted. And so you need to know a little bit about California code basics for reach code work. And in fact, a reach code, as we're talking about it, is an amendment. It's a local amendment to the state building code. So we will go over, we'll touch on all this a little more. But I wanted to mention some types of reach codes. They can address all kinds of different topics: water efficiency, green materials, recycling, electric vehicles, in addition to energy used by buildings. And one important thing to know is what is the base code that the reach code is building on. So for many of these things that are listed here, it's Cal Green, which is Title 24, Part 11. We'll talk more about that in a moment. For building energy use, it's the Energy Code, Title 24, Part 6. And reach codes that amend the Energy Code have a few more legal requirements than the reach codes that amend other parts of the building code, like as Danuta mentioned. Local governments often adopt several of these together and call it a green building ordinance. So there could be one green building ordinance that has all of the things shown in this table here. If that's the case, it's important to remember that the building energy use component of it still has those legal requirements that are different from the other parts of it. So a few words about Cal Green. It's also known as the California Green Building Standards Code. And it gets a little confusing sometimes because it has both mandatory and voluntary measures. It has some mandatory requirements for all kinds of buildings, addressing stormwater, grading, electric vehicle charging, water efficiency. It contains, but it also has appendices with some voluntary measures. And these include Tier 1 and Tier 2 energy reach codes. Local governments can adopt these tiers as reach codes, and everything that we're going to talk about today still applies. It still has to go through the same process. You still need the same backup, but they're already developed measures that are there in Cal Green, and then it is available online. You can find it. I put the link there, and the slides will be available afterwards as well. And a few words about the Energy Code. Misty's going to go into this in a little more detail later on, but for a quick overview, this is also known as the California Building Energy Efficiency Standards. It contains mandatory measures for all kinds of buildings and sets an energy budget for each type of building. I think that's the easiest way to think of it. Buildings can comply, they can follow what's known as a prescriptive path, where they do a specific set of things. So, you know, put in this insulation, this kind of window, have, you know, this kind of heating system, so on, to meet your energy budget. Or they can develop a customized approach using computer modeling to you know, you want to have more windows or something than the prescriptive path would allow. So you can develop your own method. You've got bigger windows, but better insulation on other parts of the house or something like that. And that's called the performance path. So there's mandatory measures, and then you can use a prescriptive path or performance path. And that's just important to know because reach codes can require particular energy-related measures, or they can require a lower energy budget. They can say, you know, you need to just use less energy, and that is one of the general requirements. So the Energy Code and related documents are online as well at the Energy Commission, and I put the link there in the chat. Let's get over here. There we go. So there's a wide variety of types of reach codes. They can address all types of buildings, new buildings or existing buildings, and you can have all kinds of exemptions for specific buildings, specific equipment, specific situations. So it's possible to customize your reach code in many, many, many different ways. I wanted to touch briefly on a few things that are not reach codes. There are some tools that can reach similar policy, you know, can work towards similar policy goals, but they're not reach codes legally. So for those of you who are familiar with the California Environmental Quality Act, that if you have a project that has an environmental impact, the project is required to mitigate the significant environmental impact. So that kind of mitigation measure, it can help to save energy, it can help to reduce greenhouse gases, but it's not a REACH code. It's a CEQA mitigation measure, so different legal basis. Same thing with taxes or fees. Local governments can impose taxes or fees to pay for related improvements or impacts of a project. Those have a different legal basis as well. They're not a REACH code. A gas ban or phase out, prohibition against using natural gas now or at some point in the future. Some local governments are looking at those. That's usually adopted under the local government police power, where the local government has the ability to adopt ordinances to protect the general health, safety, and welfare of the residents. So that's not a REACH code. That is a different approach. And regional and state agencies, several of them, including the Bay Area Air Quality Management District here in the Bay Area, are looking at emissions limits on appliances that limit the amount of certain types of emissions from appliances. And that is a power they have under the Clean Air Act. It's not a REACH code. It's a different approach. So I just wanted to mention these things are there. They are other tools. They're not things that we're going to be discussing in this webinar series because we're focusing on the REACH codes. So REACH codes, they are tools that local governments can use. And what we're hoping with this webinar series is to help everyone get a sense of what is the shape of the tool, what is the, is this a hammer, is it a screwdriver, is it a lever, what exactly is it? Is it the right tool that your local government needs or wants to use to reach its policy goals? So energy REACH codes, they save energy, they reduce greenhouse gas emissions, they can help meet climate action plan goals and state climate goals. Some of them save money, some of them increase building resilience. They can, depending on exactly how they are done, they can work in slightly different ways. There's a variety there. And I'm not going to dive into the details of this graphic, but just wanted to mention that we've seen an increasing interest in REACH codes in the last code cycle, focused largely on climate action and climate action goals. So just so people are aware, this has been going up. If you've been hearing more about REACH codes, yeah, there have been more of them. Although there was a bump just before this graph started, there was also a strong interest, like back here, I think like 2010, there were more of them too. So let's see. I just wanted to go over a little bit on the REACH code process here. How does the REACH code process work? And we're really going to dive into this during the next webinar on February 22nd. But for now, I want to give you a high-level overview. So generally, you start by taking a look, what are the goals, what are the options, what's the, what is it that you want to do? What are the different approaches you could take? And these parts, I really should have more complicated arrows because they feed back into each other. You take a look, what's the technical information and analysis out there? What are maybe the model codes? What are the cost effectiveness studies? And that can feed back, like what's going to give you your best options. You get some stakeholder input, and again, that can feed back. What is it you're trying to do? What do people in your community think? So all of these work together, and you gradually go round and round between these 3 steps here, and develop a proposed REACH code. So this is putting together an actual proposal. What would it look like? There are model codes out there, and anytime someone's adopted a REACH code, that basically ends up being a model REACH code. So you can look at something that someone else has adopted. I should mention here this public process, and the formal public process can look very different from one local government to another. Some cities might have a sustainability committee, or some cities might want to take this to their planning commission. Some cities, the city council might want to really drive the bus and have a number of city council meetings. Some folks might want to have a number of workshops. So this process is pretty fluid and can vary a lot from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, depending exactly on the jurisdiction, the jurisdiction's goals, the type of REACH code, and a lot of other factors. So once you have a proposed REACH code, it's been going through its process, you have the formal public process and adoption, because since this is a local ordinance, it does need to go through the local ordinance adoption process with a couple of hearings before the city council or the county board of supervisors. And then it's adopted, but you're not done yet. It needs, as Danuta mentioned, it needs to go to the California Energy Commission. It also needs to go to the Building Standards Commission for review and approval. And then it takes effect and you go ahead and you implement it. So this is the kind of the overview of where we're going. And I just want to touch a little bit on that last step with the cut out for a few seconds. Thanks for letting me know. If I missed something in particular, let me know. Hopefully you got the main points. I am going to just touch on the state agency review part for a moment, because that's something that is a little different and more specific to REACH codes. So for the California Energy Commission, as Danuta mentioned, once a REACH code is adopted, local governments need to submit the REACH codes, the supporting materials, and the findings to the Energy Commission. They have a comment period and consider the local REACH code at a public business meeting. And they'll approve the REACH code if the local government has demonstrated that it is cost effective and finds that the REACH code will not allow buildings to use more energy than the base code. So those are the relevant statute sections there for the California Energy Commission. And Misty's going to talk a little bit more about what this means to be cost effective. There's a lot of technical calculations, and webinar 3 will focus in on this one in particular. So we'll talk more about that as we go. The other state agency that we need to talk with is, or that is involved, is the Building Standards Commission. So local governments also need to send adopted REACH codes to the Building Standards Commission. And this, anytime there's an amendment to the building code, it goes to the Building Standards Commission. And that happens fairly frequently. There's so building officials, many building officials and city attorneys are familiar with this. It needs to include the finding that the amendment is necessary because of local climatic, geological, or topographical conditions. And again, this is something that most building officials and city attorneys have experience with crafting those findings, and it doesn't usually pose a problem for local governments. So there's more information here from the Building Standards Commission on exactly what's required and how to do that. So more specifically on the process, this is something just where we've broken the steps down a little more and looked at it in terms of timeline. And obviously this is very general, depending on just how it works. There's all sorts of feedback going on. Parts of this can be faster or shorter, but gives you an idea of how things might flow. And one of the key things I wanted to point out here is that you go through with a long and intense process here to develop the ordinance and then adopt it. And here is where the formal process starts, but you're not done then. It needs to go to the Energy Commission to get agendized and have their comment period, and then needs to go to the Building Standards Commission, and finally it takes effect and you implement it. And the implementation part is also a key step, because you spend a lot of time developing, like, what is the ordinance? What are you going to do with it? Once you've adopted it, you're not done. You're really just starting. You just got to the starting line. Now you need to figure out how to actually do it. So this is that's why we're going to have our final webinar will be on implementation, and we've postponed that till September, when a lot of local governments will have already gotten through many of these first steps if folks are starting now, so then we can talk a little more about the implementation. So ways to get started. It's really those first 3 steps that we talked about before. Identifying the goals. A lot of times a general plan, if it has a sustainability element, or a climate action plan, if a local government has one, will have certain goals that REACH codes can help with. And exploring the options. What are some of the ordinance options that are out there? What kinds of construction are going on in your community? Are you seeing a lot of single-family homes? Are you seeing a lot of, new businesses, new warehouses being built? Is it almost all retrofits? Because those things feed into what kind of REACH code would give you the most bang for your buck for your community. What's happening, and gather information. Some of this information here on construction types, I guess, as well as what are the cost effectiveness analyses, what are the model ordinances, what's out there. So these whole steps are information gathering, identification, exploration, and so on. And then as part of that, talking with people, talking with other city staff, especially. It's a lot of REACH code efforts are initiated with sustainability staff or with elected officials or city managers, but it's important to pull in building officials fairly quickly because they're the folks who are going to, this is all, REACH codes are implemented by building departments. It's really almost, sometimes planning is involved a little bit, but it's mostly building departments. So you want to involve your building department as early as possible and talk with them. Again, you can talk with committees if you have a sustainability committee, various community members, neighboring jurisdictions. What are your neighbors doing? You can realize that if everybody has a completely different REACH code, that gets pretty confusing for developers, contractors, architects, and so on who are working in multiple jurisdictions in the Bay Area. So if your neighbor is doing something, has similar goals, and you can align your REACH code efforts to some point, that's going to have dividends, again, when you come to implement, because it will be a lot easier for people to comply with your REACH code if your REACH code is aligned with what other folks are doing. So talk with your neighbors, and then also talk with the developers and contractors and folks. So obviously this stakeholder portion is long. You want to talk to the right people at the right time, but these are some of the people you should be thinking about talking with, and these are ways you can get going. So I'm going to pause there. That was a lot of information kind of dumped at once. And just see if anybody has any questions specifically about anything that we talked about. I don't know if there's anything in the chat or if anyone just wants to raise their hand. Or if it was all perfectly clear.
Karen, this is Angie. I haven't seen anything in the chat, but there are 2 people with their hands raised.
All right, let me see. I do see them. Let me see. I see Marissa Westerfield. So Marissa, can you unmute and do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you so much for taking this. The supporting materials and data that you said need to be provided when you submit the adopted REACH code. Are you guys going to go over what exactly those things are in future meetings?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
We'll go over those, and they are also on the BayREN website, and I can point you to those. But we can, if you don't need it urgently, we will go over it later. If you need it urgently, send me an email, and I can point you to them now.
Not urgent, but thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. And then let's see, the other question is from George Hoyt. George, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, hi. My name is George Hoyt. I'm the Chief Building Official for the City of Palo Alto. I think this question is actually for the Energy Commission. Representative, is there some thought about reducing some of the timelines and requirements associated with the Energy Commission blessing reach codes based on the fact that we really won't see what the 2022 energy code is written as, and for time to develop these and have them effective and efficient by July 1st, 2023 or January 1st, 2023.
So Misty, I'm going to ask you to take that one because I know that you are working on preliminary cost effectiveness studies that will be applicable to the 2025 Energy Code.
Okay, sure. There have been efforts, George, to reduce the time required, especially the CEC is actually in the last cycle. They had a 60-day comment period was standard, and they now have arranged where they can reduce that comment period from 15 to 60 days. And so it can be a much shorter comment period. In addition, we really recommend highly that you work with Danuta as you're approaching the time to adopt. When you're getting ready to present your proposal to council, make sure you coordinate with Danuta because she can help you ensure that you don't get delayed once you're at the commission. She can make sure because there's a bit of a process for the commission to get through. It goes through Danuta's review, and then there's a few other review cycles. There's a comment period, and then it has to be put on a business meeting agenda. And so you can get delayed by a month fairly easily if you miss those windows. And so work with Danuta up front so that she can help you make sure that you catch the right window and you can be approved in a reasonable amount of time there.
Thank you both.
And my apologies, I think I was answering the wrong question. We do try to make the process, the internal process here at the commission as seamless and quick as possible, but an ordinance goes through many different hands before it gets to the business meeting. And so we cannot always predict exactly how much time it's going to take.
Okay, I do see a couple questions in the chat. One question is, why are they developed every 3 years? And I'll give you the short answer, but Misty's going to talk about that a little more in the next part. But the code, I'm just going to say that the energy code, the building code is updated every 3 years. And so reach codes are, since they are based on that base code, they need to be updated every 3 years as well. So that relates to the next question. Could a model reach code from 2019 be adopted in the 2022 code cycle? Does a new cost-effective study need to be performed? And that's a great question. And the answers are maybe and yes. So a model reach code from 2019 could be adopted in the 2022 code cycle, possibly. Many of them, and I think many of them, I think some of them will be, in this particular case, able to do that. It needs to be confirmed that, that basically you will need to resubmit it to the California Energy Commission to demonstrate that it is cost effective and that it still exceeds, or you're not going to, even though it was developed under the 2019 code, under the 2022 code, your reach code will still require at least as much energy savings as the 2022 code. So Misty, I know you've been working on that. I don't know if you want to add any more to that now, or if you want to address it later in your part.
I think I am going to go over that in my presentation, and so I'll go ahead and address it then. And Tim, if you have additional questions, if I don't answer it adequately or Karen hasn't, please ask again. Don't be shy.
Great. Okay. So I think we have just enough time for a 5-minute break. So we're just going to take a 5-minute break, a stretch break, bathroom break for anybody who needs it. It is 10:37, so we'll be back at 10:42. So real 5-minute break. Set your phones, 5 minutes, and we'll see you shortly. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen.
And we'll get started in just a second.
About ready?
Looks like it's time.
All righty then. Fabulous. Welcome back. Hope y'all are ready for your next round here. As Karen said, my name is Misty Bruseri. I'm the coordinator for the Reach Codes program. And I am going to provide an overview of the California Building Standards Code, or the Building Code, and then the structure of the code, and also we're going to take a little bit of a look at what makes the Energy Code different within that structure. And then also we're going to cover the process of making amendments and the legal requirements that are around those amendments so that you know what you're looking at there. Okay. So the building code, the objective of the building code is to ensure the health and safety of all the occupants. The building codes are managed by the California Building Standards Commission, the CBSC for short, and they're updated regularly every 3 years. Okay. The commission is just now completing its cycle of updating the code for the 2022 code, which will be effective January 1 of 2023. And this very busy picture is an image of that update and adoption process. And I'm not going to go through every single thing here, but I do want to highlight a couple of key points. What you can see is at the very beginning of this process here, the process starts in the first year of the code. First year the code's effective. This started in September of 2020. And many of the state agencies begin working on the new code at that point. This is almost a continuous process. It's ongoing. The agencies that work on the code hold their workshops. They go through a similar process as Karen was talking about for local codes as well. They hold workshops. The BSC holds Code Advisory Committee meetings. That's the CAC. And they develop all of their proposals. They refine them. They release a draft for public review, hold more workshops, get comments, release another draft. And then finally, here in December, about the middle of the process, they hold an adoption meeting, the CBSC. They actually held 2 this time. And as part of that, they adopt the standards. This is a full year before the standards become effective. This happens. This just took place in December and earlier this month for us for the next cycle. Okay. Following that, once the CBSC adopts the standards, they file them, and then they spend this next 6 months doing a bunch of administrative work behind the scenes. And they're getting ready for publication. The law requires that the BSC publishes the standards at least 180 days before they become effective. So those standards will be published by July 1st. So we are here right now, we're waiting. The CBSC has adopted the new standards, so we have the language. They are now preparing them for publication. And so we are just waiting here for those to come out now, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff coming out in parallel. I wanted to also point out that local governments, as part of this process, local governments are required to update the new building code each cycle. That is part of the requirement. If the local government doesn't do it, it is considered adopted by default. And so that is part of the reason that you also have to update the REACH code. There is an opportunity in the middle of the cycle here that typically the energy code does not make itself, doesn't change things, but sometimes there's what they call a mid-cycle intervention, and that is an opportunity to make some changes at the 18-month point in between these cycles. But really what I want to point out here is this is an ongoing cycle. It's a very long, involved process. And so just know that it happens over a very long period of time. New standards are developed that way. Okay, so the standards have 12 parts. Each one of these parts is either focused on a particular building type or a component of the building, perhaps an end use, the electrical code, mechanical code. For our work, we are mostly focused on Part 6, the energy code. We try not to do it, but you will hear many people in the energy industry, as we're talking about energy reach codes, refer to Part 6 as Title 24, just Title 24. We often shorthand it, but we really mean Part 6 when we do that. The other part that's of interest here is Part 11, CalGreen, and Karen gave you a little bit of an overview of that. But I wanted to point out that while Part 6 focuses on efficiency, it does now also include PV requirements for most new buildings, as well as battery storage requirements for non-residential buildings in the new code. So it is updated every 3 years and does keep up with new technologies and new considerations. In Part 11, and you're going to hear this many different times. You've heard it already a few times, but you will probably hear it many more. The energy code or the energy efficiency section is different. We're terminally special. It's just always that case. But in this case, the CEC, the Energy Commission, is actually the agency that's responsible for all of the mandatory energy efficiency requirements. There are none for energy efficiency in CalGreen. All the other parts of CalGreen have mandatory requirements, but not the energy side. There are voluntary tiers, as Karen explained earlier. And also there are mandatory requirements. I know this is not what we're talking about today, but of primary interest to many of you. There are both mandatory and voluntary requirements for electric vehicles in CalGreen. But for energy efficiency for buildings, the only thing that's there is voluntary tiers. All of the requirements are held by the Energy Commission. Okay, so looking a little bit more at Part 6 and how it's different from some of the other parts. Again, our focus is on energy efficiency here. The scope is very comprehensive. It includes single-family, multifamily occupancies, as well as non-residential, and even some process loads, such as a compressed air system. What is not included here are federal buildings. Federal buildings are required to meet their federal code, and they are not subject to the state code. Okay, and I am going to talk about cost effectiveness a little bit more later, but I did want to point out that the standards, the energy code part of the standards, have to be cost effective, just like a REACH code has to be cost effective. We're both subject to the same federal regulations, which I'll also talk about in just a little bit. But they must be cost effective, and the CEC goes through that process, a very, very rigorous process to study measures and hold workshops. As a matter of fact, because of that requirement and others and the complexity, the CEC and the Codes and Standards Enhancement Advocacy teams have already started looking at the 2025 code. So we're even earlier on that spectrum than the cycle was showing in the earlier slide. Okay. The structure of the code's performance-based. That allows flexibility for for a building owner to be able to trade off different measures, as Karen explained. You can take credit for one measure that's maybe more efficient than the code requires, and it allows you to do something else over on the other side that might be a little less efficient than the code requires, provided you stay within that energy budget. You must use less energy than the standard allows. Okay. Lastly, the energy code also requires many of the building features to be field inspected and tested. And that is by certified technicians, but HERS raters for residential projects and what we call acceptance testing technicians for non-residential projects. This is in addition to the local government building inspection, your building department building inspection. These verification requirements have really helped to ensure that the technologies and equipment that are installed in a project are actually truly there and functioning properly as we intended them to. Okay. So there's some terms that come up in the energy code that are maybe not quite unique, but really I think we should cover before we talk too much more about the code. You'll hear these over and over again as we run through as the studies and the cost effectiveness analyses are being released, and as you start preparing your REACH code, many of these terms are going to come up. So first, Title 24, Part 6, compliance, is documented most often using software to create a model of the building that produces hourly energy use results for an entire year. That software is provided free by the CEC, and there are also private developers that have similar products. The CEC is required to provide a public domain version, and we call it CBEC Res or CBEC Com. CBEC Res is for residential. CBEC stands for California Building Energy Compliance Calculations Software. None of us use that, it's just CBEC. So just wanted to make sure you know that exists and that it is available for free. You can download it from the CEC site. Right now, the CEC is working on the 2022 version for next year, and there are research versions of that software available. They are not complete though. Okay, TDV, time-dependent valuation. This is something you're going to hear over and over and over. Compliance calculations use this TDV as a metric. This is the CEC's metric for both compliance and cost effective. It essentially is based on the societal cost of energy. So it includes the generation, transmission, and distribution costs. But really what's important to remember, in my opinion, is that it varies. Like for electricity, that value varies every hour, and the peak time is very, very expensive versus a non-peak time where electricity is much lower value. So essentially, the phrase that I use to remember how TDV works is that electricity used or saved during peak times is valued much more highly than electricity used or saved during non-peak times. So a KWH is not a KWH. It really does matter in the time-dependent valuation scheme when that KWH is being used or saved. Okay? And base case. Generally speaking, when we do the cost effectiveness analyses to look at what a REACH code what we could support, what kind of a REACH code the study could support, we compare them to what is generally a barely compliant model design, okay, project design. So there's very little, there's no credit, there's no penalty. The project just barely meets the minimum state requirements. Okay, that's usually the base against which all of our analyses are compared. Okay, it's kind of what would happen without a REACH code. Is the way we look at it. And then climate zones. California is a big place with a huge variety of climates. In order to deal with that and to provide appropriate standards requirements for each climate, the CEC has divided the state into 16 climate zones. We, of course, run from desert to high mountains and snow. So we've got the full range here, and then also the the very mild coastal range. So the requirements for each project vary depending on where it's located and in which climate zone. And then there's the compliance margin. Because a REACH code requires a project to exceed the base case or the minimum state code requirement, we tend to focus on the difference. What is that difference between the base case and the REACH code requirement, which we most often refer to as a margin? So a REACH code perhaps could require a project to be 10% better than the base code. In that case, we often express that as a 10% compliance margin. Our focus there is on that incremental difference most of the time. Okay. Now there's other terms, there's other special things about the Energy Code. The Energy Code is rather complex, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about that in our session 3 in March, March 22nd. Okay. Right, so now that we reviewed the state code, how do you amend it to adopt a REACH code? As Danuta and Karen both noted, California allows local governments to amend the building code, provided they meet certain requirements. There's 3 places in the state codes that provide that enabling legislation. I think both Danuta and Karen alluded to these. But what we have in our health and safety code, that's down here, you can see that, HSC in this section. This applies to all parts of the building code. There's a lot of language in here, but basically the thrust here is that the building standards shall not limit the authority of a local jurisdiction to adopt more restrictive standards. This is a key. The standards must always be more restrictive than the state code. You can't adopt a less restrictive standard. And again, specially for Part 6, we have 2 additional notes here. The Public Resources Code, which Danuta mentioned, this section actually lays out requirements for the Energy Commission. And in that, there is a section that says that provided a local jurisdiction completes the required process, the Energy Commission cannot prohibit them from enforcing a local code. So you're allowed to adopt a local code. And then here within the actual Energy Code itself, this section documents the requirements for the standards as well as the contents that need to be included in the approval application package. Okay. Alrighty. So what are the requirements? Again, you'll note we have 2 different slides here for all parts of the building code. Any amendment to the building code has to meet everything on this left side of the table. There has to be a good reason for it. The local government has to adopt a finding that the amendment is actually necessary based on these local conditions. The ordinance has to comply with all of the local requirements for ordinances. And what they mean by that is that you have to follow the appropriate process. The ordinance has to be heard at a public meeting. Typically, it requires 2 public meetings to adopt an ordinance. You have to do all those other, you have to follow that process and meet all of the local rules. In addition, it has to be compliant with all the state laws. So a local government can't adopt an ordinance that would violate a state law. And it has to be updated for each new building code cycle. This is a requirement for any amendment to the building code, including REACH codes for energy REACH codes. The requirement is that you update any amendment with all of the new code references and all of the new requirements. So doesn't matter what kind of an amendment it is, it still needs to follow each new building code cycle. Lastly, as Karen discussed, you have to file it with the state, and the ordinance has to be accessible. People have to be able to access the requirements easily. Okay. And again, especially for Part 6, there are a few more requirements that an energy REACH code has to meet, or an amendment to the Energy Code. In all cases, it has to be more stringent than the state requirements. We're going to have that word again. It has to result in the diminution of energy consumption. Basically, it has to reduce energy consumption below the level that the state would allow. Again, you can't adopt a code that would allow more energy, only more restrictive. Secondly, it has to be cost effective. The jurisdiction, the local jurisdiction, is the ultimate arbiter of that. They are the entity that determines what is cost effective. I am going to talk about that as well as the third item here in a little bit more detail in just a couple of minutes here. But I just wanted to make sure that you see that requirement first. Lastly, the ordinance is not allowed to preempt federal regulations. By that, What we mean, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, but the federal government regulates many appliances. And if they regulate an appliance, state and local governments are not allowed to regulate them in a different way. You're not allowed to preempt that regulation. So the federal government sets these standards and we must follow them. Lastly, I did just want to point out a couple of things. First, not a lawyer. Karen, none of us are lawyers. Anytime you adopt an ordinance, anytime you amend any code, you should always talk to your city or county attorney. So for all legal advice. And lastly, the Building Standards Commission publishes a guide for local amendments to building standards, and it talks about each part and the special requirements for each part. In addition to that, Stuart Tom, who used to be a building official in Glendale, did a presentation in video that runs through the process as well, also on this same page. So I highly recommend you take a look at this guide. So, as promised, more talk about cost effectiveness. If an investment is cost effective, it will yield more benefits than costs over the lifetime of the measure. What we mean by that, and I think using an example is the best way, perhaps one classic one would be an LED light bulb. LED light bulbs cost more initially than an incandescent or even a CFL, but they are very, very efficient, and so they save us a lot of money in operations. They also have a much longer lifetime, and so we don't have to change out. If it was an incandescent bulb, we don't have to change it out 15 or 20 times during the life cycle of the LED bulb, just one bulb. Because they're so efficient, the savings actually winds up being much higher than the incremental cost we paid, even when we look at it on a time basis. So that is a cost-effective investment. Essentially, that initial investment we made will ultimately save us energy and money. Okay, that can be measured in a whole bunch of different ways, which we'll talk about in depth in March. Okay, and not being repeated enough, the Energy Code is special and requires a cost-effectiveness study for any amendments. Okay. Again, the city or the county is the ultimate determiner of whether a REACH code is cost effective. In theory, one could adopt a REACH code based on some back of the envelope calcs. Say, this is our proof it's cost effective. Of course, those things would have to pass a lab test. They would have to be accepted by the community. And of course, if you're, best practices for policy making would not probably base that on a back of the envelope calc. But in theory, one could do that. It is entirely up to the jurisdiction. Okay, and okay, this next one's a little tricky. We often express cost effectiveness in two different ways in our studies. We look at it in a couple different ways. As I noted earlier, time-dependent valuation is a code and a societal perspective. It gives you, it's the perspective that the CEC uses to adopt all of its codes and to determine whether its codes are indeed cost effective as well. What we've termed on bill is really more of the individual consumer's perspective. And by that, what I mean is we take those hourly results produced by the CBEC software and we apply those to common utility tariffs for that kind of occupancy. And so we look at what an individual building owner, homeowner would actually experience on their bill. So we try to provide that information in two different perspectives so that you can see both. Okay. TDV, time-dependent valuation, is a very, very complex structure. Most of us stay fairly on the surface of it. But I think that if you remember that these two sentences over here on the right, you'll do very well with the TDV. These really help to provide, I think, a contextual, some context for it. And it really does give you enough to work with it. Okay. Lastly, how do you get one of these studies? Well, the statewide breach codes team produces cost effectiveness studies for all 16 climate zones, for new construction, and also for some existing buildings. The studies are done mostly upon request. And we have, for 2022, we're working with many local governments. We received a request from, I believe, 30 to 40 local governments for certain features to be included in our studies. And we are doing 3 new construction studies now: single family, multifamily, and non-residential study. We anticipate having some still draft results towards the end of March, beginning of April. They will still be draft. We don't anticipate having final software at that point, although they will likely be fairly well cooked. Things will be moving along fairly well by then, but they will not be final yet. Generally, what we do, because of the timing, and there's a little bit of a crunch in the summertime to try to get ordinances adopted, we release the results prior to the report. So we get our analysis results out there so you can start doing some of the outreach Karen was talking about while we write up the rest of the report and then get the report out to you to support your ordinance. So you can use those. They're available at no cost. They're done for every single climate zone. You can request a new study from the team. I list electric pool heating here as an example, because right before the holidays, we had about 4 jurisdictions. It's one of those kind of odd things, but about all at the same time, within a couple of days, asked us about electric pool heating and if there was a study or if we were planning on a study. Typically, we try to make the studies, we try to leverage the studies to be useful for more than one jurisdiction, for multiple jurisdictions if we can. And in this case, we also found out that there were other jurisdictions interested. And so we are now doing a study on electric pool heating. That study is just beginning. We are hoping to have draft results by June, but it is really at its very beginning. We're responding to that request that happened right before the holidays. Lastly, you are completely allowed to complete your own analysis. You can hire a consultant to do a study for you. If you have expertise within the jurisdiction, you can just do your own. There are multiple ways you can acquire the study. I highly recommend, if you can use the statewide studies, to do that, because they can be rather expensive to prepare a new study. And they're a bit complicated too. So you can prepare your own. There's nothing wrong with it, but do approach it with caution, I would say. Okay, and lastly, on cost effectiveness, I want to talk about cost effectiveness in climate zones. You can adopt a REACH code anywhere in the state. And typically, if a measure or a package is cost effective in a climate zone, in one city in a climate zone, it will be cost effective throughout the climate zone. That is not always true, but generally it is true. Where we found it may not be true, it typically depends on the utility, and we found that with both the investor-owned utilities and the CCEs, their rate structures tend to be very similar. And so they tend to come up with very similar results. However, some municipal utilities have very different rate structures, and so we will see some significant changes to the results under those different rate structures. So if you are in a jurisdiction with a municipal utility, please do contact me. We are able to do some custom analysis upon request. And so do let me know if you need something like that. Because the climate zones are all very different, something that's cost effective in one climate zone may not be in another, and that would be appropriate for the weather. We have very different weather. Many of the requirements are influenced by the weather and the climate, and so the things don't track from one climate zone to another. There are some that are very similar, but there are others that are also very different. Okay, and finally, what is federal preemption? This one is a very big topic that I am just going to scratch the surface on today. The Department of Energy, DOE, regulates the efficiency of about 60 types of appliances. That includes all space heating, HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, and water heating equipment. Two of the pieces of equipment most commonly in our residential analyses. Also non-res, but two big ones in the res analyses. The idea here is that the Department of Energy establishes one standard nationwide for each product. This is done for manufacturers so that they have one market, and so they don't have to meet different requirements. They don't have to meet like a patchwork of requirements throughout the states and jurisdictions. That makes it really difficult, especially with things like air conditioning and stuff like that, to ship things and to make sure that you have the right equipment in the right places. So that's the idea for having the one standard. The federal regulation preempts the state and local governments. So if there is a federal regulation, say for example, for a space heating equipment for an air conditioner, federal government sets minimum efficiency requirements for it. State and local governments are not allowed to set a higher efficiency requirement. We're preempted. We are not allowed to do anything there. If we offer a REACH code that has an option to install a high efficiency equipment, we have to have one with standard efficiency too. So this preemption, there's a lot more to the preemption here, but that is the piece that we tend to run into most frequently. Intuitively, we think REACH code, oh, high efficiency equipment, that's how you would exceed the code. But we are not allowed to specifically require that. That doesn't mean that if you have a REACH code that projects can't use it to meet the code. We just can't use it. We just can't mandate it specifically. Okay. Now, preemption also applies to state and local building codes that include anything about the energy efficiency or energy use of those same covered appliances, that same covered equipment. There is an exception for building codes, and that is the exception that our state building codes operate under. It's also the exception that our local codes would operate under. There are very specific requirements there. Preemption is somewhat unsettled as far as precedent and different interpretations of things. We'll go into this more in March, but we do need to meet certain requirements. There are certain things that you need to be aware of when establishing a REACH code that are part of those exceptions. It's a little too much to go into today. We're more than aware that this is a little bit like a fire hose of information for folks that are new. So we didn't want to go too in depth, but do keep that in mind, and we'll talk about it more in March.